It was just before dawn, and the town of Sodom hummed with quiet mischief. The cobblestone streets, slick from last night's wine spills, shimmered under the dim light of the stars. Most of the townsfolk were still asleep, but a few were already whispering and laughing about the chaos they'd stir up later that day. Lot's wife, known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, stood by her kitchen window watching the shadows of her neighbors scurry past. She often joked that Sodom was a town where rules came to die. Truth be told, she didn't mind the wild parties and the endless gossip. After all, the drama gave her life some spark. But lately, something had changed. The night before, her husband Lot had stumbled home, pale as a ghost, clutching his walking stick like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "We have to leave," he'd said, his voice trembling. "God has sent angels to destroy this place." Lot's wife had laughed, dismissing his words with a wave of her hand. Destroy Sodom? For what? A little fun and games? Don't be so dramatic, Lot. Go to bed. But Lot hadn't backed down. He told her about the two strangers who had visited him, tall, glowing figures with eyes that burned like fire. They'd warned him that Sodom's wickedness had reached its limit. God was done waiting. "They said we have until sunrise," Lot had whispered, "and we can't look back. Not for anything." Lot's wife had rolled her eyes. The thought of leaving her home, her friends, and her busy, scandal-filled life felt absurd. Yet here she was, standing at the window, unable to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. When the first streaks of sunlight began to touch the horizon, Lot burst into the room, dragging their daughters behind him. "We're leaving. Now!" he barked. His daughters, barely awake, clung to their father's robe, confusion written all over their faces. Lot's wife folded her arms. "Do you really think I'm going to leave everything behind for some nightmare you had?" Before Lot could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the front door. The angels had returned, their faces glowing brighter than before. They didn't bother knocking. They simply entered, filling the room with an otherworldly light. "Get up," one of them said, his voice commanding but calm. "Take your family and flee. Do not look back, or you will be swept away in the destruction." The room fell silent except for the quiet sobs of Lot's daughters. Even Lot's wife, who always had something to say, found herself speechless. She stared at the angels, her mind racing. What if this was real? What if they really had no time left? They didn't pack much. Just a few loaves of bread, a jug of water, and the clothes on their backs. Lot's wife hesitated in the doorway, looking back at the home she had spent years perfecting. Her favorite vase sat on the table, catching the morning light. The smell of the garden herbs she'd planted last spring wafted through the window. "Come on!" Lot yelled, pulling her arm. She reluctantly followed him, glancing over her shoulder one last time as they stepped onto the dirt road. The sky had turned a sickly shade of gray, and the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The town was eerily quiet, no laughter, no shouting, not even the sound of a stray dog barking. As they walked, the younger daughter whispered, "Mama, where are we going?" Lot's wife looked down at her child, her heart aching. "Away from here, sweetheart, just away." They moved quickly, the angels leading the way, their glowing forms cutting through the gloom. Lot walked ahead with their daughters, while his wife lagged behind, her mind tangled in memories. She thought of her friends, the bustling markets, and the grand festivals she had loved so much. Was she really supposed to leave all of that behind, forever? The angels kept their pace steady, their voices firm. "Do not stop. Do not look back." Lot's wife clenched her fists, trying to focus on the path ahead. But the farther they walked, the harder it became. Behind her, she could almost hear the faint hum of the life she was leaving, a life filled with color, noise, and excitement. She didn't know if she could keep going. The family pressed on as the sky grew darker, the air heavier with each step. Behind them, the town of Sodom lay still, a hushed giant on the verge of breaking. Lot's wife couldn't help but notice the strange silence. Where was the laughter? The shouting? Even in its wildest moments, Sodom had never felt this empty. The angels led the way with purpose, their glowing forms cutting through the haze like torches in a cave. Lot clutched his daughter's hands tightly, his voice low but urgent. "Keep your eyes ahead," he reminded them. "Don't look back." Lot's wife trailed behind, her feet dragging slightly. She glanced at the dirt path beneath her sandals, watching as it curved uphill. She couldn't stop her thoughts from spiraling. Was the town really doomed? What would become of her friends? Her favorite market stall where she bought the finest fabrics, her kitchen where she'd hosted so many lively gatherings. Her heart ached with questions she couldn't answer. And still, the angel's warning rang in her ears. Do not look back. The path grew steeper, leading toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. Lot and the girls climbed quickly, their breaths coming in short gasps. Lot's wife lagged even further behind, her legs heavy with every step. It wasn't just her body that resisted, it was her heart. Every part of her yearned to turn around to see the town one last time. She could almost hear the faint hum of its bustling streets as if the city were calling her back. Her oldest daughter, noticing her mother slowing down, stopped and called back, "Mama, hurry, the angels are getting far ahead." Lot turned sharply. "Keep moving, we're almost there." His voice carried a mix of desperation and fear. But Lot's wife barely heard him. Her mind was lost in a fog of memories. She thought of the laughter that spilled from her neighbors' windows during late-night feasts. She thought of the fountain in the town square, where she'd shared endless gossip with the other women. She thought of her life before this moment, vibrant, chaotic, and full. She glanced at the sky, now glowing an eerie orange. The clouds churned like a pot about to boil over. For the first time, a chill ran down her spine. Maybe Lot wasn't exaggerating. Maybe the angels were right. Just then, a deep rumble echoed through the valley. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Lot and the girls stumbled but kept going. "Do not stop," the angels called back, their voices urgent. Behind them, a faint glow lit the horizon, the town of Sodom. The light grew brighter and brighter, flickering like a monstrous flame. Then came a sound unlike anything Lot's wife had ever heard, a deafening roar as if the earth itself were crying out in pain. Lot's wife froze. Her heart raced as panic gripped her. This was real. Sodom was burning. She clutched her chest, gasping for air. "Keep moving!" Lot shouted again, but his voice sounded distant, drowned out by the chaos behind her. The angels didn't turn back. Their glowing forms grew smaller as they disappeared over the ridge. Lot and the girls followed, their figures swallowed by the smoky horizon. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood there, transfixed. The destruction was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a haunting beauty she couldn't look away from. But the warning still rang in her ears. Do not look back. She didn't realize how long she'd been standing there, staring. The air around her grew colder, the weight of something unseen pressing down on her shoulders. Far ahead, Lot and the girls reached the top of the ridge, unaware that she had stopped. The angels' voices echoed faintly, their command growing more distant. "Do not stop. Do not look back." Lot's wife stood frozen, her gaze locked on the burning city of Sodom. The once bustling town was now engulfed in chaos, its walls crumbling under waves of fire and ash. The flames licked the sky, turning it an angry red, while thick smoke billowed into the heavens. A low rumble, deep and unrelenting, vibrated through the air as if the very earth was mourning the city's destruction. Her mind swirled with emotions, grief, disbelief, and a pang of guilt that gnawed at her soul. The city had been her entire life. Every corner, every creaking door, every familiar face carried memories she couldn't shake. She thought of her neighbors, their voices playing in her mind as if they were still just a call away. The baker who always saved her the freshest loaves, smiling warmly as he handed her the soft, golden bread. The seamstress who shared her quick wit and made her laugh during long market days. The older woman down the street who had watched her daughters grow and always offered advice even when it wasn't needed. Were they gone now, swallowed by the flames that climbed hungrily across the buildings? Her thoughts shifted to the streets, now consumed by the inferno. She could almost hear the echoes of life, the clinking of coins as merchants haggled, the laughter of children chasing each other through the alleys, the rhythmic music of the festivals she had loved so much. The vibrant, chaotic energy of Sodom had been intoxicating, drawing her into its fold day after day. It was more than a city, it was a piece of her soul. Now all that remained was ruin. A tear rolled down her cheek as the memories gripped her harder. Far ahead, Lot and their daughters had reached safety at the top of the ridge. They stopped, their chests heaving as they caught their breath. Lot leaned heavily on his staff, sweat dripping from his brow, but his focus was elsewhere. He scanned the trail behind them, searching desperately through the thick haze. His daughters, pale and trembling, clung to his arms. "Where's your mother?" he asked, his voice hoarse with worry. The younger daughter sobbed, clutching his robe. "Mama was right behind us!" she cried, her voice rising in panic. "She was with us! I swear she was with us!" Lot's heart sank, a cold dread settling over him. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the distance. The smoky air swirled like a curtain, obscuring the path. She can't have stopped," he muttered. Though even as he said the words, a gnawing certainty clawed at him. She had looked back. She had disobeyed the warning. The older daughter wiped at her tears, her voice cracking. "Papa, we can't leave her. What if she's hurt?" she pleaded, her face full of anguish. Lot clenched his fists, the weight of his decision crushing him. He lowered his head, his voice trembling. "We cannot go back. We were warned," he said, the words bitter and heavy. He couldn't bear to look his daughters in the eyes. He knew his wife's heart, how deeply she clung to the life they had left behind, and he feared it had cost her everything. Back on the path, Lot's wife remained rooted in place. The ground beneath her felt foreign, as if it no longer welcomed her presence. The air around her seemed to grow colder, heavier, pressing down on her shoulders like an unseen weight. A sharp wind tore through the valley, carrying the acrid stench of sulfur and charred wood. The wind stung her eyes, filled her lungs, but still, she didn't move. For a moment she thought she heard someone calling her name. The voice was faint, distant, carried on the howling wind. It sent a shiver through her body, her pulse quickening. Was it Lot? Her daughters? Were they waiting for her, begging her to catch up? Or was it something else? The city, calling her back, pulling at her heartstrings like a lover unwilling to let go. Her heart raced as she wrestled with the weight of her decision. She wanted to keep walking, to catch up with her family and the safety that lay ahead. She could hear Lot's urgent voice in her mind, reminding her of the angel's warning. But the pull of her past was too strong. The life she had left behind, the people, the places, the memories, it all tugged at her like invisible chains. Just one more glance, she thought, her resolve crumbling. Then I'll go. She turned fully now, her body trembling as her eyes fixed on the destruction. The city of Sodom, once a symbol of energy and indulgence, was unrecognizable. The flames had consumed nearly everything. The grand square where she had walked countless times was nothing but a blackened void. The bustling markets filled with spices and fabrics had vanished into piles of ash. The towering gates, once a proud symbol of the city's might, had crumbled under the unrelenting heat. And yet, she couldn't look away. There was a strange beauty in the chaos, a haunting allure to the way the fire moved, devouring everything in its path. Her gaze lingered on the ruins of her home. She could still see it in her mind. The garden where she had planted flowers with her daughters, the kitchen where the smell of freshly baked bread had filled the air, the small table where her family had shared their happiest moments. Now, all of it was gone, reduced to smoke and embers. A wave of grief washed over her, sharper and more profound than anything she had ever felt. She had wanted so much to carry those memories with her, to hold on to the life she had built. But now she realized they were slipping away, consumed by the same fire that had destroyed her home. The ground beneath her feet began to feel strange, unsteady, as if it were shifting under her weight. A chill swept through her, colder than the wind, and her breath caught in her throat. Her body stiffened, and an eerie numbness began to spread. It started at her toes, a tingling that quickly turned into a heavy, unrelenting weight. She looked down and gasped. Her feet were no longer flesh and blood. They were turning white, grainy, like coarse salt. The transformation spread quickly, climbing up her legs and into her torso. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't move. Her arms froze mid-reach, her muscles locked in place. She wanted to cry out, to call for Lot, but her voice was gone. Her eyes, still fixed on the burning city, began to blur as the numbness reached her face. The flames of Sodom flickered in her vision one last time before everything went dark. And then there was silence. At the ridge, Lot felt it. A strange stillness in the air, a cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He turned back one last time, his heart heavy with dread. She looked back, he whispered, his voice breaking. The angels stood beside him, their faces solemn. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder. "There is nothing you can do," the angel said gently. She chose her path. Lot sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. His daughters clung to him, their sobs filling the air. None of them dared to look back. As the sun rose higher, its light fell on the valley below, revealing a lone figure standing on the path. Where Lot's wife had once been, there was now a pillar of salt, stark and unmoving against the desolate landscape. Her form was frozen in place, her head turned toward the city, forever looking back at what she could not let go. The wind howled around her, scattering tiny grains of salt into the air. The city of Sodom burned on, its flames casting eerie shadows on the ground. A strange stillness in the air, a cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He turned back one last time, his heart heavy with dread. She looked back, he whispered, his voice breaking. The angels stood beside him, their faces solemn. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder. "There is nothing you can do," the angel said gently. She chose her path. Lot sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. His daughters clung to him, their sobs filling the air. None of them dared to look back. The sun climbed higher into the sky, bathing the valley in an eerie light. Sodom was no more, reduced to a smoldering wasteland of ash and rubble. Smoke curled upward, blotting out the horizon like a mourning veil. And on the lonely path leading away from the ruins, the pillar of salt stood silent, a grim reminder of the consequences of looking back. At the top of the ridge, Lot and his daughters sat huddled together. Their breaths came in shaky gasps, their faces streaked with tears. The younger daughter clung to Lot's arm, her voice trembling. "Where's Mama?" she whispered. Lot didn't answer. His eyes stared blankly ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, on the path they had left behind. He couldn't bring himself to say the words aloud. How could he tell his daughters that their mother had disobeyed, that she was gone forever? The older daughter, her face pale with shock, finally spoke. Did she look back?" Lot nodded, his throat tight. She did. The younger daughter burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. The older one reached for her father's hand, gripping it tightly. "What do we do now, Papa?" she asked, her voice cracking. Lot swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. "We keep going," he said firmly. "We must." The angels stood nearby, their glowing forms dimmer now. One of them stepped forward, his gaze resting on Lot. "You have been spared for a purpose," the angel said. "You and your daughters must leave this place and start anew. Do not let your grief weigh you down. There is still hope for you." Lot nodded slowly, though his heart felt heavy. Hope seemed like a distant, unreachable thing. Still, he knew the angels were right. They couldn't stay here. The past was gone, and there was no going back, not for him, not for his daughters. The angels turned and began to fade, their forms dissolving into the hazy light of dawn. Their final words lingered in the air. "Remember this day, and do not forget its lesson." Lot and his daughters began their descent into the wilderness. The path was rough, the ground uneven, but they pressed on. The girls walked in silence, their heads bowed. Lot glanced at them, his heart aching for their loss. He knew the road ahead would be hard, but they had no choice but to keep moving. As they walked, the pillar of salt came into view behind them. The daughters turned away quickly, not wanting to see, but Lot allowed himself one brief glance. The figure was unmistakable, still, cold, and unmoving. It wasn't just a statue. It was a story, frozen in time, a warning for all who might come after them. Do not look back. Days turned into weeks as Lot and his daughters journeyed through the wilderness. They survived on what little food and water they had, relying on their father's guidance and their own resilience. Slowly, they began to rebuild their lives, finding strength in each other and in the lessons they had learned. But no matter how far they traveled, the memory of that day stayed with them. The image of Sodom's destruction, the roar of the flames, and the sight of their mother turned to salt. It all lingered, shaping their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. Years later, as Lot sat by a small campfire with his daughters, he gazed up at the stars and thought of the city they had left behind. He thought of his wife, her sharp wit, her laughter, her love for the life they had built together. She had made her choice, and though it had cost her everything, Lot couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for her. "She couldn't let go," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His daughters, now grown, sat beside him, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. The older one looked at him thoughtfully. "Papa," she said, "do you think we'll ever stop remembering?" Lot sighed, his eyes glistening. "I hope not," he said. "Some memories are meant to stay with us, to teach us, to remind us of what matters most." The younger daughter nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "And what matters most?" she asked quietly. Lot smiled faintly, his voice steady. "To look forward," he said. "Always forward." As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the family sat together in silence, the weight of their journey heavy but not unbearable. Above them, the stars shone brightly, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to guide them. And in the valley below, the pillar of salt stood untouched, a timeless testament to a single moment, a glance back at a world that could never be reclaimed.